Welcome to episode 6 of Low-Class Forgotten Family Recipes. In the heart of America's hardest days, when pennies decided meals and hope simmered in cast-iron skillets, one dish rose quietly above hunger. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't pretty, but it was survival on a plate. Welcome to episode 6 of Low-Class Forgotten Family Recipes, where we unearth a gritty, golden bite from the past, the grease-soaked potato cake. This was not your average meal. This was the taste of desperation, fried in the last spoon of saved lard. It was built from scraps, stale mash, bits of onion, leftover grease, and yet, it filled empty stomachs, warmed cold hands, and reminded families they were still holding on. Today, we dive deep into 10 shockingly real versions of this forgotten dish, each one shaped by poverty, improvisation, and pure human will. From the crusty cornmeal-coated version to the bitter greens from backyards, every cake tells a story you won't believe. Stay with us as we pull back the curtain on one of America's most overlooked yet iconic survival foods, because the grease may have sizzled away, but the story still crackles. Now, let's uncover the first type, the most foundational and widespread version of them all. The classic lard-fried mashed potato cake. This wasn't just a recipe. It was a ritual born out of emptiness. In the poorest corners of 1930s America, where work was a memory and hunger a constant shadow, families clung to one dependable thing, the humble potato. Cheap, durable, and filling, potatoes were often the only thing a family could afford in bulk. Mashed, boiled, or baked, they were a lifeline. But what happened when even potatoes grew dull, or when mealtime demanded more than just bland mash? That's when the magic of grease came in. You see, bacon drippings or pork lard were never thrown away. Instead, they were saved in metal cans and treasured like gold. Just a spoonful was enough to transform dull mashed potatoes into crispy, savory cakes that crackled with life. Mothers would mix leftover mashed potatoes with flour, maybe a pinch of salt, sometimes not even that. The patties were shaped by hand, dropped onto a hot skillet slicked with grease, and fried until golden on the outside and steaming soft on the inside. No fancy spices. No measurements. Just instinct and survival. These potato cakes weren't luxurious, but for families who went to bed with growling stomachs, they were golden coins of comfort. Children would crowd around the stove, noses high in the air, hypnotized by the sizzle, waiting for a single hot patty to be split between siblings. And yet, even this simple version had its own twists. Because what one family lacked, another substituted creatively, and that leads us to the next unforgettable twist in this Depression-era recipe legacy. Now, moving beyond the classic lard-fried mashed potato cakes from part 1, let's dive deeper into the world of America's forgotten low-class family recipes, meals born not out of luxury, but out of necessity, resilience, and resourcefulness. During the Great Depression and earlier times, many families across America faced severe poverty. Access to fresh, expensive ingredients was rare, and people relied heavily on basic staples like potatoes, cornmeal, and whatever they could grow or gather from their surroundings. These simple ingredients became the foundation for countless recipes that have since faded from common memory. These recipes were rarely written down. Instead, they were passed orally from one generation to the next, shared among neighbors, and adapted based on what was available. For example, mashed potatoes, which started as plain leftovers fried in saved lard, were often stretched and flavored with whatever families had on hand: onions, wild herbs, scraps of vegetables, or stale breadcrumbs, to make the meals more filling and flavorful. America's diverse immigrant population also played a key role in shaping these dishes. Irish, German, Southern, and Appalachian communities all brought their own traditions, blending them with local ingredients and techniques. This cultural fusion created uniquely American comfort foods that were both affordable and satisfying. More than just survival food, these recipes represented family bonds and community strength during tough times. They were shared over humble meals, symbolizing hope and endurance. Though many of these dishes have disappeared from modern tables, they remain an important chapter in America's culinary and social history, reminding us of the grit and creativity that defined everyday life for so many families. As we continue, we will explore the next forgotten recipe, onion-infused potato cakes, where flavor met frugality. Now that we've rediscovered the humble brilliance of onion-infused potato cakes, let's turn to another lost gem from America's struggling families, cornmeal griddle slapjacks. This dish was a lifeline for families across the rural South, especially during the early 1900s and the Great Depression. With flour becoming scarce and sometimes too expensive to buy, cornmeal became a pantry essential. It was cheaper, more filling, and could be bought in bulk or bartered at local markets. But slapjacks weren't just a meal, they were survival shaped into golden, crispy rounds. The name, slapjack, came from the way the batter was quickly slapped onto hot griddles or iron pans, often over open fires or wood-burning stoves. The batter itself was a simple mix: cornmeal, water or buttermilk if available, a pinch of salt, and sometimes a dash of baking soda if it could be spared. Some families added a touch of bacon grease or lard to enhance the flavor and prevent sticking. But what made slapjacks special wasn't just the ingredients, it was the way families used them. These griddle cakes were often served at breakfast, stacked on metal plates or even reused newspaper, sometimes topped with a spoonful of syrup, a slice of apple, or just a pat of whatever fat was on hand. When paired with beans or greens, they made a full, hearty meal that could stretch to feed everyone. These slapjacks were also deeply communal. Children helped mix the batter while elders cooked. Neighbors often shared cornmeal or traded homemade batches when someone was in need. And in colder months, these golden cakes were often the only warm comfort in an otherwise harsh day. Today, they've almost vanished from kitchens, but their legacy lives on as a symbol of American grit and culinary creativity under pressure. Next, we'll explore a dish that might surprise you with its cleverness: stale bread pudding with bacon drippings, a sweet and savory twist that made use of every last crumb. As we turn from the golden griddle slapjacks, we arrive at a dish that blended sweetness, saltiness, and pure resourcefulness: stale bread pudding with bacon drippings. To modern ears, that combination might sound unusual. But for struggling families during the Great Depression and earlier, it was nothing short of brilliant. When money was tight and waste was unthinkable, every stale loaf of bread had potential. And if there was bacon on the table that week, even the leftover drippings were too valuable to discard. This pudding began with the humblest of ingredients: day-old bread torn into chunks, often stored in cloth bags until there was enough. It was then soaked in a mixture of milk, or watered-down evaporated milk, eggs if available, and sugar or molasses. But here's where it took an unexpected turn. A spoonful of bacon grease was stirred in, adding a richness and subtle smokiness that elevated the flavor in a way only necessity could invent. Families baked the pudding in battered pans set inside wood-fired ovens or over coals in cast-iron pots. Raisins were a luxury, but sometimes added if there was a holiday or a lucky trade. More often, a sprinkle of cinnamon or nutmeg gave the dish a fragrant boost, making a modest dessert feel like a grand treat. What made this dish special wasn't just its flavor, it was its purpose. It showed how even scraps could be transformed into something comforting, something worth gathering around the table for. Children loved the slightly crispy edges, and the center stayed soft and custard-like. It was often served warm after dinner, or cold the next morning with a dollop of jam if it could be spared. Bread pudding like this may no longer grace modern menus, but for generations of low-income families, it was a testament to ingenuity and the quiet joy of making do. Next, we'll uncover a Depression-era stew that stretched the impossible: cabbage and dumpling pot, a one-pot wonder that fed entire families from a few cents worth of food. As we leave behind the sweet warmth of bacon-laced bread pudding, we enter the heart of the Depression-era dinner table, a bubbling pot of comfort and necessity known as the cabbage and dumpling pot. This one-pot meal was a lifeline for countless American families during hard times. It was cheap, filling, and adaptable, everything a struggling household needed. Cabbage was a staple crop, cheap, easy to grow, and available year-round in many regions. But its real magic came when combined with flour dumplings and whatever odds and ends were left in the pantry. The process was simple. A large pot was filled with water or weak broth, and roughly chopped cabbage leaves were tossed in to simmer. On good days, onions or carrots joined the pot. On most days, it was just cabbage and salt. But the dumplings were what turned this thin stew into something memorable. Made with just flour, water, a pinch of baking powder, and sometimes a touch of lard or bacon grease, the dough was scooped into rough spoonfuls and dropped into the pot. As the dumplings swelled and steamed atop the cabbage, they absorbed all the flavors of the broth and transformed the dish from watery to hearty. Sometimes, leftover bits of meat were added, just scraps from a ham bone, or the last shreds of salted pork. But even without them, this meal had everything a family needed to keep going: warmth, volume, and just enough flavor to make it feel like a real supper. It was dishes like this that defined the era, not because they were extravagant, but because they stretched so little into so much. The cabbage and dumpling pot wasn't about luxury, it was about survival with dignity, and feeding a family with both stomach and spirit in mind. Next, we journey into a fried treat that was both clever and comforting: onion flour fritters, where the bite of onion met the crunch of desperation. From the steaming pot of cabbage and dumplings, we now shift to the frying pan, where meager ingredients turned into crisp, golden treasures. Let's talk about onion flour fritters, a Depression-era snack or side dish born out of necessity, yet full of flavor and pride. In times when meat was scarce and vegetables were limited to whatever could be pulled from a backyard patch, onions became a lifeline. They were cheap, stored well, and packed a punch of taste. Families learned quickly how to stretch their food budgets by transforming onions into the main act. That's how these humble fritters became a favorite. The recipe? Almost laughably simple. Sliced or finely chopped onions were mixed with a handful of flour, a little salt, and just enough water to create a sticky batter. On rare occasions, an egg might be added to improve the texture, but most went without. The mixture was dropped by spoonfuls into a hot skillet shimmering with bacon grease or lard, whatever cooking fat could be saved from previous meals. The result? Crispy-edged, golden brown fritters with tender centers and the savory, slightly sweet bite of caramelized onion. They were eaten hot off the pan, sometimes with a dab of mustard or vinegar, but often just as they were. Simple, satisfying, and unmistakably Depression-era. What made onion flour fritters more than just food was their symbolism. They weren't just snacks, they were proof that flavor didn't require luxury. That warmth could come from a hot pan and a pinch of ingenuity. Kids would wait hungrily by the stove as their mothers flipped the patties, and even if bellies weren't full, spirits were lifted by that smell. These fritters are rarely seen today, but once, they held an important place in American kitchens. They turned scarcity into crunch, and hardship into something to gather around. Next, we'll explore a breakfast staple that began as animal feed and became a family's secret to starting the day: hot cornmeal mush with drippings. Coming straight off the sizzling onion fritters, we now turn to a morning ritual that fueled generations through America's hardest hours: hot cornmeal mush with drippings. Cornmeal mush wasn't just food. It was survival in a bowl. For low-income families during the Great Depression, cornmeal was a kitchen essential, affordable, shelf-stable, and endlessly versatile. And when cooked slowly over heat, it transformed into a thick, porridge-like dish that could keep hunger at bay for hours. This meal began with simple ingredients: cornmeal, water, and salt. That's it. The cornmeal was stirred into boiling water and cooked low and slow, sometimes for over an hour, until it thickened to a creamy, hearty consistency. But what gave it soul, what turned this basic mush into something memorable, was the addition of meat drippings. You see, after frying bacon, sausage, or any meat, if families were lucky enough to have it, the leftover grease wasn't wasted. It was saved, stored in tins or jars, and reused to flavor otherwise plain meals. A spoonful of this smoky, salty fat was drizzled over a steaming bowl of mush, instantly transforming it into something rich and deeply satisfying. Hot cornmeal mush was often served for breakfast, but families also ate it at lunch or dinner, whenever something warm and filling was needed. In the evenings, the leftovers were poured into pans, cooled until firm, then sliced and fried the next day into golden cornmeal cakes. It was humble, but it was also deeply American. This dish traces its roots back to early settlers, enslaved African communities, and Native American traditions, all of whom used corn in creative, nourishing ways. Hot cornmeal mush with drippings was a reminder: Even in the harshest times, resourcefulness could turn nothing into something. It didn't just feed the body, it preserved dignity, one spoonful at a time. And now, we venture into a supper classic stitched together from leftovers and hope, the scraps casserole, a dish where every bit mattered, and waste was not an option. Following the hearty comfort of hot cornmeal mush, we now uncover a Depression-era masterpiece that proved no scrap was ever truly waste, scraps casserole. This dish wasn't born from a cookbook, it was born from necessity. In the poorest households of 1920s and 30s America, tossing food was unthinkable. Every crust, bone, wilted vegetable, or spoonful of leftover stew was saved, combined, and transformed into one warm, filling meal, the scraps casserole. Families didn't follow recipes, they followed their pantry's reality. At its core, this dish was a mix of whatever was available. A heel of bread soaked in milk, a scoop of yesterday's mashed potatoes, some leftover beans, broken pasta, cabbage leaves, or even a single chopped hot dog. Everything was layered into a baking dish or pressed into a cast iron skillet. To bind it together, people often used a bit of lard, condensed milk, or even just water and flour stirred into a gluey paste. If they had an egg, it was a luxury. On top, breadcrumbs from stale bread or crushed crackers gave it that coveted crispy crust. Then it was baked, slowly, until it was browned, bubbling, and carried a scent that made hungry stomachs rumble. Each scraps casserole was unique. No two were the same. It was more than a meal, it was a patchwork quilt of the week's survival efforts. It was often served for Sunday supper, when the week's remnants were combined and nothing went to waste. This dish is a forgotten triumph of poor households, creative, filling, and dignified. In homes where food stamps didn't yet exist and soup lines stretched down the block, this casserole kept hope alive in bubbling, golden brown layers. It was resourceful, practical, and heartbreakingly honest. A meal that told the story of a family doing everything it could to survive with what little it had. And now, we turn to a dish that was once breakfast, dessert, and emergency rations all in one, molasses slab bread, a sticky sweet brick of resilience from America's hungriest days. After exploring the savory survival of scraps casserole, we now reach a forgotten treat that brought a touch of sweetness to America's hardest days, molasses slab bread. During the Great Depression and earlier, refined sugar was rare and expensive for low-income families. But molasses, thick, dark, and rich, was affordable and plentiful, often a byproduct of sugar refining and sometimes given away in rural communities. With just a few pantry staples and a bit of molasses, families created what came to be known as molasses slab bread, a dense, chewy loaf that could serve as breakfast, snack, or even dessert. The ingredients were painfully simple: flour, baking soda, a pinch of salt, water, and generous spoonfuls of molasses. If lucky, a family might stir in leftover oats or a smashed banana. The batter was poured into a tin or iron pan and baked until firm but sticky, a heavy brick of energy, nourishment, and just enough sweetness to lift spirits. It didn't rise much. There was no yeast, no butter, and no eggs. But it was satisfying, long-lasting, and comforting. Kids would break off pieces to nibble throughout the day, and adults ate it alongside coffee or dipped in leftover bacon grease for a rare sweet-savory pairing. Molasses slab bread told a story in every bite. It was dark and bold, just like the times it came from. Mothers often wrapped thick slices in wax paper for their children to carry to school, when lunch boxes were empty. Others saved it for Sundays or holidays, slicing it thinly and savoring it with a smear of lard or homemade jam, if available. It wasn't cake. It wasn't bread. It was something in between, and that's what made it magic. It symbolized making do, finding joy in simplicity, and stretching ingredients to feed both the body and the soul. And now, we approach one of the most mysterious and often overlooked Depression-era staples, boiled flour dumplings, where plainness met survival in the most unexpected way. And now, we end this journey with perhaps the most humble of them all, a dish that had nothing to hide, because it had almost nothing at all. Meet the boiled flour dumplings, a survival staple that filled countless bowls when cupboards were bare and hope was stretched thin. This dish was born not out of tradition, but out of desperation. a creative invention from those who simply refused to let their families go hungry. With just flour, salt, and water, a sticky dough was kneaded and shaped into lumpy balls, then dropped directly into boiling water or broth made from bones, vegetable peels, or even just salted water. The dumplings were soft, chewy, and bland on their own, but they were hearty, filling, and full of meaning. Sometimes they were served with drippings from fried fatback or a splash of canned tomato juice. Occasionally, they floated in thin stews made from garden scraps or foraged greens. In immigrant communities, these dumplings echoed European peasant traditions, passed down through generations but stripped to their bare essentials during hard times. Boiled flour dumplings weren't made to impress, they were made to survive. They represent the final line of defense in the kitchen, a last-ditch effort to stretch a meal where no meal seemed possible. And yet, many who grew up eating them recall them fondly. Because more than just food, they were a reminder of resilience, family togetherness, and creative endurance through America's toughest years. So there you have it, 10 deeply moving, often forgotten recipes that shaped the tables of America's low-income families during history's hardest chapters. If you found this journey valuable, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss these powerful stories from America's past. And hey, if you missed any of the earlier episodes in this series, we've got you covered. Links are in the comments section below. Go check them out and continue rediscovering the heart of true American resilience, one dish at a time.